Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Column EDC Coffee Chat, Coffee with Colleen. We are excited to have Emma Dexter today join us. Emma is going to be presenting about PCBs, and she is with Seattle 2030 District, and I believe also there's a sister organization, Bellevue 2030 District. And so before we kick it off, however, just a few housekeeping items. I want to make sure we stay on mute so everyone can hear Emma. And also, if you have any questions for her, it looks like we have a small group. I think just either raise your hand and you can ask, or put your question in the chat, and I'll go ahead and ask it for you. So with that, Emma, I know you have your slides all ready to go. We already practiced, so please take it away, and thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thank you all for having me this morning. I'm excited to be presenting. Can you all see my title slide there?
Not yet.
Let's see. The screen sharing is paused. I don't know if I'm not having access to it. Let me see.
Make sure. That says multiple participants. Did you see it, John? Oh, you're on mute. I didn't see it come up.
Neither did I.
Okay. We
How about
practiced
now?
and it was beautiful.
It says my screen sharing is paused. I'm not sure if that means.
Yeah, has started screen
Is it
sharing.
because
Double click to enter full screen mode.
is it because the
Huh,
now that there's a recording, is it because
I don't know. I've never had this happen before. Double click to enter full screen mode. So I double clicked and I saw it just for a second.
oh, let's see.
View. Oh, there it
we
is.
go.
We got
Yeah.
it. Mhm.
All right. Can you still see it?
Yes.
All right. So now I'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here bright and early. I'm super grateful for this opportunity to host this workshop and discuss PCBs and building materials. My name is Emma Dexter. I'm Sustainability Program Coordinator with the Seattle 2030 District, and I'm currently managing an education and outreach campaign that targets PCBs and building materials. And this work is funded by the Washington Department of Ecology and the EPA. Can you all still see that? Or did you see my slide change? Amazing, we're in business. Okay. So to give you a bit of
Actually,
information.
we didn't. I'm sorry. I don't think we saw the slide change.
Yeah, it's still on the title slide.
Oh, okay. Let's see. There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
So to give you a bit of information about the organization I work for, the 2030 District Network is a system of public-private partnerships that's comprised of property managers, service stakeholders, building owners, and different folks in the community. So there are currently 24 different districts across North America, and we leverage these strategic partnerships to work toward a variety of climate goals, including a 50% reduction in energy use, water use, and transportation emissions by the year 2030. We're also working for a number of grant-funded projects that are focused on sustainability in urban environments, and this PCBs Education Outreach campaign is one of those. So I wanted to give a little shout out to our funding partners as well. So from 2021 through 2022, the Washington State Department of Ecology developed resources that were developed to characterize and abate sources of PCBs within building materials. And the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts were awarded a grant through the Strategic Stormwater Initiative Lead to launch this campaign. And it's intended so that property owners can understand more about the risks of PCBs and building materials and the tools for identification and abatement that ecology has developed. I'm really grateful to be here today presenting as a continuation of that campaign.
So Emma, quickly, is this what drove the 2006 um, legislation that mandated, I think it was a 70% reduction in energy use in new homes built by 2030, but then over COVID, they bumped it up to 2031. Is that what prompted
Perhaps.
that legislation?
I think I'm not sure if that's what prompted it. That might have been more at the federal level. This project is sort of working toward, I think, existing like legacy materials as well. So it targets less newer builds and more about how to create change within existing structures and
Okay.
supporting energy transitions and things like that within existing buildings. So I know that there are, I know in Seattle and as well as other places, there are some new legislation and like regulations that have come online, and so there are like penalties now that can be incurred if those reductions aren't met. So our kind of goal is to connect building managers and property owners with specialists in energy and water who can help meet those goals so that they don't have to incur those, fees.
Got it. Okay.
Does that make sense? I can talk about that
Yes.
more later. Okay. So the purpose of today's presentation is to provide a bit more context regarding first the harms of PCBs and building materials, the responsibilities of building managers and property owners, and the risks of inaction, and then also the resources that have been developed by the Washington Department of Ecology and the EPA to identify and dispose of these materials for both the health of our communities and the protection of our environment and with regulatory compliance. I wanted to give a brief outline of our agenda for the next 40 minutes. I'm going to go over the basics of PCBs. A lot of you are probably wondering. I certainly had no idea before I took on this work. So what are they? Why are they a concern? I'm next going to cover the legal framework regulating PCBs and address why these were and continue to be necessary today. I will also review a case study to demonstrate how this process played out at one site. And I'll end the content portion of this video by highlighting the resources that are available from the Department of Ecology and the EPA to help building managers and property owners start testing and remediating if they suspect their building might contain PCBs. So now that we have all that covered, we can just dive right into understanding what are PCBs and why are they a concern. So in short, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, they're a class of synthetic chemicals that aren't found naturally in the environment. They were developed by Monsanto, and there are about 209 different compounds within this class. So they all have the same sort of base chemical structure, and then it just depends, how many chlorines, and that's what creates all these different kinds of compounds. So they were used in many different common building materials starting in the 1930s until 1980, but they were used most from 1950 to 1980. They can be in either a liquid or a non-liquid form, and they can be present in a variety of building materials from paint to caulk and grout, fluorescent lighting ballasts, and a lot more materials. You'll see a list here on the right hand of the screen, but I'll also give you some examples on the next slide of what exactly this looks like. So while the manufacture of PCBs was banned in 1979, they can still be found in buildings that were built or renovated before or around this time. And this is because the ban was on the manufacture of PCBs rather than the use of PCB-containing materials. So this meant that contractors could use contaminated materials that they already had in their possession, through the decade, through the 1980s, even after their manufacture had been banned. So this means that buildings that were constructed or renovated between 1980 and 1989 are also at risk, though this risk is a bit lower. So PCB containing materials can pose health risks, and they contaminate soil, stormwater, sediments, and indoor air. They're persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals. And being bioaccumulative means that they're going to build up in people and animals over time through consistent exposure. And it means that there are more concentrated organisms at the top of the food chain. So this could mean, orca whales. And so the impacts are salmon populations, which connects to our southern resident killer whale population, and it affects our sediments and organisms across rivers, lakes, and estuaries in Washington. They also take a very long time to break down, so they're going to remain in the environment as well as our living organisms for extended periods of time. It's going to cause just kind of long-term harm to our environment and our organisms. So that's why the fact that PCBs are still an issue, they remain in our buildings and they're going to remain in our animals and sediments for a lot longer as well. So where are PCBs detected and why are they still being detected today if they weren't built into any more materials since the 1980s? Various studies have shown that building materials are still active sources of PCBs. So you'll find them most commonly on building exteriors, and this is where they're most often an issue. So particularly in items like paint and window caulking, and this is significant because when these materials are disturbed through, say, demolition or renovation or just weathering. So either, just precipitation and rain or, pressure washing, this can lead to greater discharges of PCBs into our environment. So I wanted to include some examples of what to look for and, materials that tested positive for PCB so that this isn't just an abstract concept because it's kind of hard to imagine like what is a PCB. So you can see these close-up images of, this is the grout and the caulking that's on exteriors. You can see it's kind of cracked. It's around these sealant areas. I also wanted to include a picture of, this is Jasper. He's a detection dog with the detection dog program, which is really exciting and cool. But Jasper has been trained to sniff out PCBs. So we think of them as being like odorless and invisible to us, but Jasper was part of an exciting initiative where he can detect the flow of PCBs from the exterior of a building, which is really exciting. So I wanted to include a picture of him at work right here. Here are some additional samples of what this looks like. Pretty innocuous to the untrained eye. I wouldn't have been able to pick these out of a lineup, but especially on exteriors, this sort of paint and caulking and grout is something to look out for. Specifically in buildings of the vintage, 1950 to 1989. In newer builds and constructions, this isn't something you need to be looking out for because those materials are no longer used in new buildings. So PCBs on the exterior of building materials continue to be active sources of this toxin. They flow, the flow of stormwater, so specifically runoff that originally fell as rain or wash water from pressure washing, the flow of that into our drainage systems has been identified as the main pathway taking PCB contamination from source to surface water, sediment, and biota. For this reason, many water bodies in Washington don't meet the water quality standards of PCBs. And you can see in this table here, notably the level of PCBs in Puget Sound fish are increasing while other toxics that have been banned are either decreasing or have remained steady. So this discovery actually happened kind of inverse to how I've described it. So water quality experts first noticed that the level of PCBs in fish was still increasing, which didn't make sense because PCBs are no longer being manufactured. So they were able to trace back this contamination pathway to discover that active sources were those legacy building materials from the 1950s through the 1980s. So they were able to sort of trace back this process and discover, okay, our exterior building materials are still releasing PCBs into stormwater, which is an issue. So the consequences of, as I've already alluded to, PCBs have toxic effects on the immune system, the reproductive, nervous, and endocrine systems as well in people as well as other organisms. They're known to cause cancer in animals, and they're very likely to cause cancer in people. Even at super low concentrations, PCBs in water can impact aquatic life and human health. So they're considered to be one of the most significant toxic chemicals in the Puget Sound. Um, First and foremost, this has led to fish consumption advisories, which many of you might already be familiar with, but most commonly fished waters in Washington are all contaminated with PCBs. One detail I've never been able to forget when I kind of started diving into this topic was that there's no population of salmon in the Puget Sound with a permissible level of PCBs. And that's always just stuck with me, especially given how important salmon are, as a, economic resource, as a cultural resource here. That's really significant. And as
So
you can
Emma,
imagine, yes,
oh, I'm sorry, keep on going. I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, go ahead.
So the wastewater treatment facilities today, are they able to filter out PCBs that are coming from the older construction?
I don't think so. And I mean, this is just sort of water that's sloughing off building exteriors. So it's not necessarily going through a treatment system. If it goes into our drainage system, it might be treated, but it also can just sort of run off into, aquifers, streams. It's not necessarily going into a treatment system. So that's why
But
this.
if it's so, like the city of Port Angeles spent, I don't know, $50 million or something on a combined sewer overflow to
Mhm,
treat wastewater. And the average age of a home, I just heard this from Ben Browdick from the city of Port Angeles. The average age of a house in Port Angeles, I think, is 1962. So it's
mhm.
very much that vintage. And we've got this Western Harbor group cleanup going on, and PCBs is one of the toxins that we're trying to address. So, and I've always thought the PCB contamination was only from the carbon that was burned from previously from the mills. But it sounds, I'm learning now, no, it's continually sloughing off from the older housing. But so, and the wastewater is treated by the city plant. Would that be treating the PCBs before it enters into the water?
That's a great question. I can't answer it with true certainty. I'm just coming into this space, so I can definitely connect with one of my the experts I've been working with on this. I know that there are ways to treat it, and like even using just carbon socks and things like that, and capturing wastewater and wash water before it gets into drainage systems and making sure it's treated. But if you have installed proper treatment, I think you can target PCBs and make sure they're taken out of the water before they're discharged into, water bodies. So hopefully, I mean, ideally that would also address PCBs, but I can double check to make sure that that's something that, um, like what Port Angeles has implemented would also be targeting PCBs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think this project in particular is also it's meant to address PCBs at the source. So rather than, having to clean them up, it's kind of targeting them at the source. So what do you what do you want to do in a bathtub's like overflowing? Are you going to grab a mop first? Or are you going to try to turn off the tap while it's running? So I think that's sort of the approach with this campaign, but treatment, is also incredibly important because until all sources can be abated, this is going to continually be an issue. So I think you made a great point, and I can double check that answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, wonderful. Um, so this is also an environmental justice issue since tribal communities in Spokane, for example, are unable to fish according to their treaty rights. If there are unsafe levels of contamination, it means that they can't fish according to, um, what they're entitled to. And it's also caused several Superfund sites to be established, which are just areas regulated by the EPA for long-term cleanup of hazardous substances. And these health concerns highlight the importance of addressing PCB contamination. So there's a lot of different reasons to care about this issue from a regulatory standpoint to an environmental and human health standpoint, a justice standpoint. We try to meet people wherever they are and try to get them to care about this issue in whatever way, is most important to them. So for some people, this is economic issue to make sure they're not incurring fines, or, getting out ahead of abatement rather than not expecting PCBs to pop and then having to deal with them down the line. It's an economic issue as well. So there's lots of different reasons to care about this, which is why it's so exciting. So let's review now the legal framework around PCBs and the requirements that different stakeholders are responsible for. So there are a variety of regulations targeting different facets of PCB contamination, from first limiting manufacture, halting their production entirely, to mandating how proper disposal has to work. And these are operating both at the federal and the state level. So there's lots of different mechanisms at work here. So one you might already be familiar with is the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, and this was enacted in 1976. It was the federal law that banned the manufacture of PCBs, but not their use, which I touched on earlier. TSCA was established to regulate the manufacture, import, use, and disposal of chemical substances, and the primary aim here was to protect human health and the environment. This regulation gives the EPA the regulatory authority over hazardous substances, including PCBs, specifically under Section 6 of TSCA, and that means that any PCBs above 50 parts per million, or ppm, are not allowed to be used anymore. So that they're the most large sources of closed PCBs, so kind of PCBs already in buildings, are addressed through these laws that govern the manufacture, storage, disposal, and cleanup. So this is TSCA. It's also the Washington State Dangerous Waste law. It's also the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, which is also known as like the Superfund Act, and then also the Model Toxics Control Act, which is MTCA, and that's the Washington Department of Ecology's sort of state equivalent. It's their Superfund cleanup law as well. In addition to these laws that target closed PCBs, water regulations also apply when PCBs are exposed and are just sort of dribbling off buildings. So this includes the Clean Water Act. It includes the Washington Water Pollution Control Act, RCW, which prohibits the discharge of polluting matters into waters, and Surface Water Quality Standards, or WAC, which a lot of municipal stormwater permittees will be familiar with. And so these guidance documents and regulations, they're meant to, address PCBs, but also make sure that you're not in violation of Clean Water Act, which is pretty significant. So you want to make sure that you're not polluting surface water, things like that, and targeting PCBs at the source is a really great way to do that. So these were also integrated recently into the Stormwater Management Manuals for Western Washington, and they updated the guidance about PCBs. So language around PCB best management practices were just recently added. I've been working with a lot of municipal stormwater permittees who are kind of navigating this new language, and so there's been a lot of interest around PCBs in this context. And so this language was it was added to include more guidance about roof and building drains at the manufacturing and commercial buildings. It was also included to give more guidance on washing and stream cleaning vehicles, equipment, building structures, what to do with construction, demolition, and then also building repair, remodeling, painting, construction, all of these, which are activities which are likely to involve the release of PCBs. So it's guidance about, best management practices around, if you're doing these activities, how to prevent the runoff of PCBs that could contaminate, wastewater, wash water, which could get into the drainage system and then contaminate our waters. And you can find the link to the most recent Stormwater Management Manual on Ecology's website. I'll go into more of these resources a little bit later. But I wanted to provide a timeline that sort of illustrates how the Washington Department of Ecology mitigated this issue. So first, it was identified that building materials are still an active source of PCBs, and that stormwater was the main pathway for this contamination. And Ecology integrated some related factors, including what they know about source control, what was included in earlier action plans, as well as guidance and regulatory standards. And from there, they were able to draft and add new language around PCBs to MS4 permits. And it was decided that, the MS4 was the best tool through which to address this issue. And it's really about how to target this issue at the source rather than just have to rely on continual cleanup while these PCBs just continue to be released. And these BMPs were included to just highlight actions that could avoid the release of PCBs from buildings into stormwater, especially when performing washing, construction, and redevelopment. So I wanted to highlight a case study that involves an exterior source of PCBs and explore how this process played out just out at one site. So I'm not sure if any of you saw the exterior scaffolding on Rainier Commons from I-5, but there's been an ongoing remediation project there since the early 2000s. Rainier Commons is a mixed-use development featuring residential, warehouse, and storage spaces. It used to be the old Rainier Brewery, but it's been updated since then. This complex is currently composed of 24 buildings, all situated across a 4.6-acre lot. And in 2004, the Seattle Public Utilities conducted just routine testing in the catch basin, and they identified this site to be a source of contamination. From their findings, they were able to pinpoint the exterior paint as the source of PCBs, and they collected 86 samples to determine the total extent of this issue. So it's difficult because PCBs are, like other toxics, very inhomogeneously distributed. They can be, there can be a big cluster here, there can be just a couple here. So testing has to be fairly extensive in order to determine, how big of an issue is, like how wide is contamination dispersed here. As I mentioned, the legal limit for PCBs is 50 parts per million. And initial site sampling revealed some pretty significant levels, 2,200 parts per million in a trench site and 213,000 parts per million of PCBs were contained in the exterior paint. So these were clearly the source of the problem right here. When talking about timelines for remediation, it's really important to recognize that they depend heavily on case-specific conditions and they fluctuate greatly from site to site. However, for Rainier Commons, at least, the first sample was collected in 2004, and the drainage basin and system underwent a cleaning in 2008. Fast forward to 2010, and the EPA collected indoor samples from June to September just to understand the extent of the problem here. And in December 2013, the EPA approved a general work plan so that tangible results could be observed by 2014 with the removal of the exterior paint from the most contaminated buildings. So, 2004 to 2014, that's kind of a 10-year span. That's a pretty long time. I think that's one of the longest I've heard about. And this was sort of one of the first remediation practices that happened for PCBs. So I know when I talked to the folks who were on this project, they said there were a lot of lessons learned here. So every time, a site undergoes remediation, we're going to learn more about best practices for how to do that and what could hopefully increase timelines and decrease costs. So Rainier Commons used abrasive blasting and hand removal techniques for this abatement, and they made sure to contain the spread of contamination during removal, which involved putting up containment apparatuses and adhering to, cleaning best practices among other actions, just to make sure that when they were doing this demolition and renovation to abate PCBs, they weren't, releasing them, because those are the activities that are going to expose PCBs and put them at most risk of contaminating stormwater. So it was important that when you're abating for that issue, you're not also going to be contributing to that, and it's not going to be its own problem. So since this case study started, there has been a significant reduction in PCB contamination within the Seattle Public Utilities catch basin and the original site. So as of today, removal efforts are still ongoing, and they're prioritizing the worst offender buildings, but significant progress has been made on this site. It's been able to reduce contamination overall in this Seattle Public Utilities catch basin. I wanted to provide a little illustration to show generally how the timeline for PCBs abatement unfolds, though it's important to recognize again that these timelines are greatly dependent on site conditions and they're going to fluctuate significantly from a case-to-case basis. We kind of think of this as being, we think of there as being three main causes that can trigger the discovery of PCBs. One could be, you're testing before you're undergoing renovation, in the same way you test for lead and asbestos, and there are best practices for that. Increasingly, contractors are testing for any toxics of concern, and this includes PCBs. So they could be detected in this process before a renovation. They could also be detected in stormwater. So just like what happened at Rainier Commons, if utilities is testing and they identify PCBs in stormwater, they can trace it back to your building, and they're going to go on a little investigation to see which building is at fault for releasing us into stormwater. It could also be due to investigation from negative health impacts. People could be reporting that they're feeling sick, that there's something in the building that's going to make them unhealthy. And so it could be that PCBs are identified as that main issue. So it could happen through materials testing by a design team or from like a third party materials testing from municipal agencies or something like that. If levels of PCBs are found above the permissible threshold, abatement actions are required. And buildings with PCBs at or above the regulatory threshold must report findings to the appropriate agencies and begin work based on their project site characteristics. So this is likely going to involve some reporting to the EPA or the Washington Department of Ecology. Depending on the severity of contamination, there are sort of different standards for reporting. And there's more information about that on the website that I will cover in just a little bit. So talking about costs, because this is a significant consideration for a lot of people, it's important to stress that these are going to vary significantly, and it's really hard in general to give any sort of estimate without knowing the exact extent or location of where contamination is located. But there are resources for, costing sheets to help create these estimates once you do some testing, and those are available on Ecology's website. However, the main costs are associated with planning and reporting, adhering to structural and operational BMPs, the costs that you'll have to have with the sampling, analysis reporting, waste handling, because there are laws around that, and then also just general demolition and renovation when you're trying to get in and access those sources of contamination. So as you can tell, this is going to depend on how pervasive is the issue. Is it an exterior source like paint, or is it going to be in a expansion joint when you have to like actually go into a building, and that process is a little bit more invasive. So it's going to fluctuate and depend heavily on your site. And as I just mentioned, building managers and property owners are required to produce adequate documentation for these activities for reporting purposes, and the EPA does have to be notified when abatement and remediation activities are being started and once they're completed. So proper documentation should generally include, what was the source, what was the best known date of this discovery, what's the description of the location and the materials that were been contaminated, how were they cleaned, how are they disposed of, and then also some post remediation sampling is a best practice. So going back in and testing just to make sure that PCBs above 50 parts per million aren't still popping, and to just demonstrate that you've properly addressed the issue here. So this has been a lot of information for you all, but I want to begin to wrap up the content portion of this workshop by highlighting the available resources that have been developed by Ecology and the EPA, as well as the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts, to provide building managers and property owners with this information and guidance. So the Washington Department of Ecology provides a lot of different resources on their website to help us understand just sort of more background and context information. So why were they used in building materials? What materials are most likely to contain PCBs? What are their impacts on people and the environment? The steps to take if you suspect your building might be might include PCBs. So if you know that your building was of this vintage, if it was built between 1950 or the 1980s, or if it underwent a renovation, that's sort of your first step to know, okay, is there a risk that my building might contain PCBs? They provide a lot of guides on regulations and reporting standards, and then just plenty of frequently asked questions, lots of different resources you can access if you look up, PCBs and building materials. You can kind of find everything you would like to see right there on their website. And then the EPA also includes these resources. This is sort of the parent organization that wrote out this initial guidance. So it's going to provide all of that federal regulation that you have to abide by. So this page is a super valuable resource, and it can help building managers and property owners sort of navigate this issue and manage contamination concerns really effectively. I also wanted to include the contact information for the Region 10 PCB coordinator, which is our area here. So any specific questions or concerns about how to proceed, or if PCBs have been detected and you're not sure how to proceed from there, it's great to contact Brett at the EPA, and he'll have all the questions about how to do this in Washington State. Finally, I wanted to end by touching on the resources that have been developed by my organization, the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts. We've developed an education and outreach toolkit that has been designed to help you address PCBs in your local area. We've developed a toolkit with everything you would need to host sort of your own education event, sort of like what I'm presenting here. So for stormwater permittees in particular, there's an education component about PCBs that needs to be fulfilled. So this sort of workshop, hosting this in your jurisdiction, can fulfill that requirement and help you meet your permit regulations. We've developed a number of mailers as well to inform property managers and building owners about PCBs in this issue. We've accessed a lot of publicly available data to compose lists of buildings that are very likely to contain PCBs just based on their year, their size, their use type. And we developed that for Thurston, Kitsap, and Pierce County across Washington. So this is available data that we're happy to share with people, so that if they want to disseminate these resources in their jurisdiction, we can totally support that. And this support is funded by the Department of Ecology and the Washington and the EPA. That's what our grant is for. So hosting your workshop or sending out these mailers is free and easy as long as you contact us. We're happy to provide them. We also have some upcoming workshops in our education series. We're going to have one that's in person on June 24th, and that's going to be at UW's GIX building in the Bellevue Spring District. We're being joined by the Detection Dogs program, which is super exciting. I'm excited to dive more into that topic. I know this isn't the most glamorous issue, but I think when you bring in this like PCB detection dog program, to me, that's just the coolest thing ever. So I'm really excited to be partnering with Jasper and his handler, Julianne, to talk more about that. And you can watch the most recent recording of our webinar on the Seattle 2030 District YouTube page. If you have any questions or want more information, please contact me via email. And again, these are just free and easy opportunities to spread awareness about PCBs and how to prevent them from, spreading contamination, really addressing this issue at the source. I also wanted to just give a sneak peek of what's included in this toolkit. So it's a Google Drive, but it contains a ton of information. It includes more about case studies. It includes this sort of slide deck. It includes outreach collateral, so sample sort of templates that you just need to fill in with, the date and the location and the time. It includes more on contact information, frequently asked questions. If you're hosting a Q&A, it includes sort of sample questions that you can seed a conversation with. And it also includes a survey at the end. So it's super, super rich toolkit with a ton to dive into. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. This is sort of a final resource page and resource slide of if you want to look at our target building lists, if you want to learn more about these resources from the Department of Ecology or the EPA, you can scan the QR code and look at these resources, or you can also access our toolkit. So I'll be sure to share this with you all and make sure you have this available to you. But for now, we can jump into a Q&A. I'm happy to take any of your questions. Again, my role here today is a little unconventional. I'm here to share about this information, but I'm not a PCBs expert myself. But I'm very lucky to be partnered with folks at the Department of Ecology who have just a wealth of information on this topic. So I'll try to address any questions you have, but I can make sure to write them down and get them answered by the professionals. And I can share those answers with you, Colleen, to make sure everyone has them at their disposal. So I've talked to you all for quite a while, so I'm going to open it up to you now. Take any questions you have.
Great. Thank you, Emma. So Paul asked 2 questions in the chat, and I think you can take down the slideshow now. So he asked, how concerned should we be about the EPA's 2024 decision to reject the Department of Ecology's request for stricter limits on PCBs?
How concerned should we be?
Mm-hmm.
I would say fairly concerned. I'm not familiar with this legislation, whether it's stricter regulations for the manufacture of PCBs, or because there are some PCBs are produced as a byproduct in some special cases. They're no longer manufactured for use in building materials like they originally were. Um, I would say it's great that we already sort of have this work underway, and the more we can spread information and knowledge about, you know, their risks and the ways you can mitigate it, those easy first steps and the things to look out for, I think spreading that information. But I'm certainly an advocate for tighter regulations, having seen how they impact our environment, and especially if there's regulatory standards, so that, you want to make sure that they're not being produced because you don't want to be responsible for incurring a fine. You don't want to be in violation of the Clean Water Act. That's pretty significant. So the tighter we can be about regulating these, the less responsibility people like building managers and property owners have. So that's my perspective, I would say, but I can get this question answered. I would say more regulation on these toxic chemicals is more important. At this point, they have no positive effects. So we want to make sure they're getting out of our waterways.
So, and I don't know if you can answer this, but his second question is a 2-foot soil cap. So there's a site in Port Angeles called the Rainier cleanup site, and it's at the waterfront, 75 acres. And it had formerly been a paper mill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, a mill. And
so pulp mill.
Pulp mill, thank you. This is a pulp mill. And so the proposal right now is a 2-foot soil cap on the contaminants. And these contaminants do contain PCBs at this site. Is that enough to protect the public? In your
That's
opinion?
a great question. Thank you, Paul, for these questions. I would say one of the strategies for abatement and remediation is encapsulation. So depending on where PCBs are, so if it's in paint, for example, on the exterior of a building, one strategy that is acceptable is to cover that up with a non-PCB containing paint and make sure it's sort of encapsulated in that way. And that is an effective strategy. So I would say, depending on what the contaminants are like, if they're already sort of stored in barrels, or if the waste is contained in a way and then buried, I would say that is an effective strategy. I think the 2-foot soil cap would be enough, as long as there's sort of a way to make sure that it's not exposed. It's sort of encapsulated in a way so that water isn't trickling down and washing this into like aquifers, for example. You want to make sure it is contained and there's no way for it to sort of leach out.
So
I would need
the
to.
situation, Emma, is that the mill was there for decades and decades, and the mill is gone, but the soil where the mill was located contains PCBs today. And so the proposed order cleanup action plan, I believe, is to put 2 feet of soil on top of this existing contaminated soil. They may have like a sparge curtain or something that would prevent any contamination in the soils from getting into the water. But so I think the question is, it's not that they're contained. This is, the proposal is to isolate it by putting a 2-foot cap of clean soils on top of all of the contaminated soils.
Thank you for clarifying that. That sounds like an effective strategy to me based on what I know, but I'm happy to connect with folks I've been working with and get their opinion on this, because I'm sure that theirs would be more informed than mine. But based on that, that sounds effective to me.
Paul, do you want to ask anything further?
No, thank you, Colleen. Thank you for your.
Paul.
You're welcome. So does anybody else have any questions for Emma?
There's a question from John in the chat saying, follow up to the 2-foot cap. Is this what was done in Tacoma at their waterfront park, and was it successful? I'm not sure what's going on in Tacoma, unfortunately. I can look into this case study. If they work, all of this requires, these abatement practices usually require work and reporting with the EPA. So I'm sure these processes have been sort of informed by their feedback. And I know that, if you go to your regional coordinator and you say, this is our issue, what do we need to do? They might be the ones to say, you need to implement like a 2-foot soil cap. And that is your effective strategy, because it will be so different based on, what materials are the ones that are contaminated. What is the footprint of this? So I can look into the Tacoma case study and see if it was successful. I hope it was.
Yeah. So this is not, the Rainier site is not an EPA Superfund site. It's managed by, it had been initially, as I understand, but it's managed by Department of Ecology. The cleanup is.
Yes, that's right. And they're still remediating it, but it's also still an active site. I mean, there's still businesses there, people still live there. So
in Tacoma, you mean?
Oh, no, at Rainier Commons.
Oh, so you're talking Rainier. I'm talking Rainier, which is in Port Angeles.
Okay.
So that's a different site. Okay.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any questions for Emma? If not, I think we will call it a morning and give you 10 minutes back. Thank you so much for joining us and educating us. If anybody would like a copy of the slides, I have those, and I'll be happy to send you the link to those in the Google Drive as well, because it's about a 25 megabyte slide deck. So I don't think I can share the slide deck itself, but certainly can share the Google Drive link. All right. Thanks, everyone, and have a great morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.